I'm a 33-year-old guy, and to say my relationship with my dad is complicated would be putting it mildly. Growing up, he was more of a visitor than a parent. My mom was the one holding everything together, working 2 jobs most of the time, while my dad lived like a carefree bachelor. He wasn't completely out of the picture, but his contributions were more like sporadic gestures, buying me a toy here, showing up for a soccer game there, than actual parenting. My mom, on the other hand, was relentless. She worked mornings as a waitress and evenings cleaning offices. I still remember her coming home late at night, her hands raw from scrubbing floors, just to put food on the table. My brother and I didn't have much, but she made sure we had what we needed. My dad? Let's just say he wasn't the type to sacrifice his comfort for anyone else's. One moment stands out like a neon sign in my memory. It was my junior year of college, and I was on the verge of getting kicked out because I couldn't pay $1,000 in tuition. I didn't have anyone else to turn to, so I called my dad. I laid it all out for him, how I'd been working part-time, how I just needed this one push to stay in school. He told me you should have planned better. That was it. No apology, no offer to help. I hung up and didn't know what to do. Then, my mom did what she always did. She saved the day. She sold her car, the only reliable one we had, to cover my tuition. I don't know how she managed to get to her jobs after that, but she didn't complain. She just smiled and said, "You better make this count." That was the moment I swore I'd never depend on my dad again. Fast forward to now. I worked my way up in my career and hit 6 figures last year. I own a modest house, drive a decent car, and for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm standing on solid ground. I've even been in therapy for a while, working through a lot of the resentment I've carried toward my dad. But just when I thought I could finally leave all that behind, he showed up. It started with a phone call. My dad, now 65 and retired, said he couldn't afford his rent anymore. He was calm about it, almost casual, like he was asking me to grab a cup of coffee. He wanted to move in with me just for a while. He didn't give many details, just that he was struggling and needed my help. I didn't know what to say, so I told him I'd think about it. That night, I called my brother to get his take. He didn't mince words. "Don't let him in," he said. "You'll never get him out." He reminded me of all the times our dad had left us hanging, how he never paid child support on time, how he skipped my high school graduation to go on a fishing trip, how he spent money on his girlfriend's kids while we scraped by. "He's a leech," my brother said. "You don't owe him anything." Still, I couldn't shake the guilt. He's my dad, after all. But then came the bombshell. He told me, "It's payback time. I raised you. Now it's your turn to take care of me." That sentence hit me like a truck. I thought about all the nights my mom spent crying because she didn't know how we'd make rent, all the birthdays he missed, all the times I needed him, and he wasn't there. And now, he's asking me for help? To make things worse, he decided to air our dirty laundry on Facebook. He posted this long rant about how his ungrateful kids were abandoning him in his old age, painting himself as the victim. The comments section blew up, with half the people agreeing with him and the other half tearing him apart. My phone started blowing up with messages from relatives and friends. Some said I should forgive him and let him move in. Others said I owed him nothing. Even my therapist didn't have a clear answer. She said this was a chance for me to set boundaries, to decide what kind of relationship I wanted with my dad. But setting boundaries with someone who ignores them is like putting up a fence in a hurricane. It's going to get blown away. My mom has been supportive, as always. She told me to do whatever brings me peace, but even she seems conflicted. She knows better than anyone what my dad is like, but I think part of her still feels bad for him. So here I am, stuck between my own feelings and everyone else's opinions. Part of me wants to say no and move on with my life. The other part worries that I'll regret turning him away, even after everything he's done. I don't know what the right answer is, but I know this, whatever I decide, it's going to change our family forever. Update 1. After my dad's Facebook rant blew up, my brother stepped in and suggested we have a family dinner to lay everything out. He thought it might help if everyone got on the same page, or at least if I had some support in explaining my side. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but I agreed. If nothing else, it felt like the only way to stop the back and forth messages and calls I'd been getting from family members. We met at a local restaurant that had a private dining room. It was just the 4 of us, my dad, my brother, my mom, and me. My dad showed up looking disheveled, which wasn't like him. He leaned heavily on his cane as he walked in, playing up his frailty in a way I hadn't seen before. He greeted us with a sigh, settling into his seat like he'd just finished a marathon. Once the food was ordered, my dad launched into a monologue about how hard things had been for him. He said his landlord was raising the rent, his retirement checks didn't cover the bills, and he had no one else to turn to. He talked about how much he'd sacrificed for family and how disappointing it was that his children weren't stepping up to help him now. He painted this picture of himself as a martyr, someone who had always done his best but was dealt a bad hand in life. It was hard to sit through, but my brother didn't let him get too far. When my dad paused to sip his water, my brother cut in, calmly but firmly. He said it was time for some honesty, and that if my dad wanted help, he needed to own up to how he ended up in this situation. That's when my brother dropped the bombshell. My dad had gambled away a big chunk of his retirement savings. He'd been a regular at a local casino for years, and when the money ran out, he'd started borrowing from friends and relatives. My brother also revealed that my dad had spent thousands of dollars on his girlfriend's kids while ignoring us. My dad tried to laugh it off, saying my brother was exaggerating, but my mom chimed in. She backed up everything my brother said and added her own stories. She talked about the times my dad had drained their joint bank account for frivolous purchases, leaving her scrambling to cover bills. She reminded him of the years he went without paying child support and how she'd been left to pick up the pieces every time he bailed on his responsibilities. My dad got defensive, saying he did the best he could and that none of us knew how hard it was for him back then. He claimed he wasn't perfect but still deserved respect and support. I stayed quiet for most of the conversation, letting my brother and mom do the talking. But when my dad started to turn the blame on us, I finally spoke up. I told him I understood that he was in a tough spot, but I needed time to figure out what was best for my mental health and my life. I said I wasn't ready to make a decision about him moving in, and I wouldn't be guilt-tripped into rushing it. That's when he snapped. He slammed his hand on the table and called me ungrateful. He said I owed him for everything he'd done for me and stormed out of the restaurant, leaving the rest of us sitting there in awkward silence. My brother was the first to break it, telling me I did the right thing. He reminded me again that I didn't owe our dad anything, and that this was just another example of him trying to manipulate us. My mom agreed, saying I needed to prioritize my peace, but even she seemed a little shaken by the outburst. Later that week, I talked it over with my therapist, who helped me process everything. She encouraged me to focus on what aligned with my values, not what other people expected of me. She also suggested I start looking into affordable senior living options for my dad as a way to set a boundary without cutting him off completely. As I was researching, a distant relative reached out to me. They told me my dad had borrowed money from them years ago and never paid it back. They wanted to warn me not to let him move in, saying he'd take advantage of me just like he had with them. It was another piece of the puzzle, and it made me even more wary. Meanwhile, my dad's Facebook posts kept coming. He called me selfish and cold-hearted, accusing me of abandoning him in his time of need. The posts started to gain traction among mutual acquaintances, with some people siding with him and others calling him out. It added to my stress. But my close friends stepped in to remind me that setting boundaries wasn't wrong. They told me to ignore the noise and focus on what I knew was true. Still, it wasn't easy. Even with everything I'd learned and everyone who supported me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I might be being too harsh. But deep down, I knew I had to draw the line somewhere. This was just the beginning. Update 2. After the disastrous family dinner, I decided to spend the weekend at my mom's place to get away from the chaos. She lives in a small but cozy apartment, filled with knickknacks and photo frames that tell the story of her sacrifices over the years. As we sat in her kitchen, catching up over coffee, I noticed a worn leather journal tucked away on a shelf. It looked out of place among the cookbooks and mail piles, so I asked about it. My mom hesitated for a moment before handing it to me. She said it was something she'd kept during the rough years when my brother and I were kids. I flipped through the pages, curious but not expecting much. What I found stopped me cold. It wasn't just a journal, it was a record of every time my dad had let us down, every choice he'd made that left us struggling. There were entries about him spending their rent money on a new stereo system, notes about how he'd promised to help pay for school supplies, only to back out because he'd forgotten he needed new tires for his car. One page stood out in particular. My mom had written about the day she sold her car to pay my college tuition. She wrote that my dad had the money to help but refused out of spite, saying I needed to learn responsibility. The words felt like a punch to the gut. I took the journal home and brought it up in my next therapy session. My therapist encouraged me to process what I'd read without jumping to conclusions, but it was hard to stay neutral. The journal painted a clear picture of someone who had the means to help but consistently chose not to. It wasn't just neglect, it felt calculated, like he'd made an art form out of avoiding responsibility. As if on cue, my dad's girlfriend reached out the following day. She sent me a long text saying I needed to get over the past and do the right thing by letting my dad move in. She claimed he was too proud to ask anyone else for help, which didn't add up considering the number of people he'd already hit up for money. The message ended with a plea to remember that family comes first, which felt ironic given my dad's track record. That evening, I got a voicemail from my dad. He said he needed an answer by the end of the week, and that I should remember where I came from. It wasn't hard to figure out what he meant, but it only added to the pressure. I called my brother to vent, and for the first time, he shared some of his own stories. He told me about times our dad had borrowed money from him, promising to pay it back but never following through. He mentioned how their relationship had been rocky ever since our dad skipped his wedding to go on a fishing trip. Hearing these things made me feel less alone in my frustrations, but it also deepened my resolve not to cave. The journal started to shift opinions within the family. My mom decided to share some of its contents with a few relatives, and suddenly people who had been siding with my dad started backing off. It didn't take long for one of them to contact me with another revelation. My dad still had gambling debts. They sent me screenshots of messages where he'd asked for loans, promising to pay them back after a lucky streak that clearly never came. Things took an unexpected turn when my dad decided to drag my workplace into the mess. I got a call from HR who let me know he'd emailed them, claiming I was neglecting family duties and painting himself as a helpless retiree. Thankfully, my employer saw through his tactics and offered their support, even providing resources for dealing with harassment. It was embarrassing, but it also reinforced my decision to keep firm boundaries. My mom, as always, stood by me. She told me not to let guilt cloud my judgment, reminding me of all the times she'd had to choose between keeping the peace and standing up for herself. She said she'd spent too many years sacrificing for someone who never prioritized her or their kids and didn't want me to make the same mistake. To cover all my bases, I consulted a lawyer. They confirmed that I wasn't legally obligated to support my dad, which was a relief. At the same time, I started noticing that my dad's behavior was alienating even more of the family. He'd been asking everyone he could for money, and his desperation was starting to wear thin. Meanwhile, my Reddit post had gone viral. The comments section was split, with some people arguing that family comes first no matter what, while others shared their own stories of cutting off toxic parents. It was eye-opening to see how many people were dealing with similar situations, and their advice helped me start to see things more clearly. I realized that every choice I made needed to be about protecting my peace. My dad's actions had put him in this position, and it wasn't my job to fix it. For the first time in a while, I felt like I was gaining some clarity. Update 3. It started with a phone call from the hospital. My dad had been admitted after what they described as a minor health scare. The nurse on the line didn't go into details but mentioned chest pain and high blood pressure. She assured me he was stable, but I should come by to discuss his situation. I debated whether to go, but my brother insisted on coming along. He wasn't convinced this was as serious as it sounded and warned me to tread carefully. He knows how to pull strings, my brother said, and I knew exactly what he meant. When we arrived, my dad was in a shared room, propped up on a pillow and hooked to a heart monitor. He looked older than I remembered, thinner too. He greeted me with a weak smile and said, "I knew you'd come." Then, he launched into a detailed recounting of his ordeal, how he'd been feeling lightheaded, how he thought he might be having a heart attack, and how he'd been terrified he wouldn't make it. It was dramatic, to say the least, but the nurse's earlier tone told me it wasn't as dire as he was making it seem. As we talked, the conversation predictably shifted to his living situation. He wanted to know if I'd made a decision. "This could happen again," he said, gesturing toward the machines monitoring his vitals. "I need to be with family." He reminded me that family sticks together and threw in a line about how I'd regret it if I turned him away and something happened to him. It felt less like a conversation and more like a guilt trip on steroids. While we were there, something unexpected happened. One of his ex-girlfriends from years ago showed up to check on him. She didn't recognize me at first, but eventually put 2 and 2 together. As we chatted, she let a few things slip about their time together, specifically, how reckless he'd been with money. She laughed about how he used to max out his credit cards on nonsense, from expensive dinners to gadgets he didn't need, and how she'd had to cover the bills more than once. He's always been creative with finances, she said, not realizing how much her words confirmed everything I'd been discovering. Later that evening, his current girlfriend sent me a long text. She claimed she couldn't take him in because her lease didn't allow additional tenants. She framed it as if she was heartbroken about the situation but kept emphasizing that it was now my turn to step up. She even suggested that I should be grateful for the chance to support him. It felt more like a sales pitch than a genuine request. My next therapy session focused on organizing my thoughts. My therapist suggested writing a pros and cons list about letting my dad move in. It felt almost trivial compared to everything that had happened, but I gave it a try. Unsurprisingly, the cons far outweighed the pros. The biggest one? Financial ruin. I'd recently learned that my dad had thousands of dollars in unpaid debts. One of his friends, who'd loaned him money years ago, reached out to me and casually mentioned how my dad never repaid him. He hinted that if my dad moved in, he'd likely expect me to help him with those debts. Meanwhile, my mom added another piece to the puzzle. She told me about a time when my dad had emptied their joint savings account to buy a motorcycle. This was back when my brother and I were kids, and we needed money for school supplies. My mom had to borrow from a neighbor just to get us the basics. Hearing these stories only solidified the picture of someone who never thought twice about his responsibilities. During this time, my brother opened up about his own experiences. He revealed that our dad had been asking him for money for years, using similar tactics of guilt and manipulation. My brother had always refused, but the constant harassment had taken a toll on him. It was the first time I'd seen my brother truly break down over the situation, and it made me realize just how deep this pattern ran. As if that weren't enough, my dad's Facebook posts were still gaining traction. More family members started reaching out, either to offer support or to shame me for not helping him. It was exhausting trying to keep up with the messages, especially as some of them turned downright nasty. Even my Reddit posts sparked debates, with some users accusing me of being cold-hearted, while others shared their own stories of estranged parents. The tipping point came when I overheard my dad talking to a nurse during one of my visits. He didn't realize I was standing just outside the curtain. He was joking about how once he moved in with me, he could sell my house and use the money to finally enjoy retirement. I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. This wasn't just about having a roof over his head. He had plans for my life, my home, my finances, without a second thought about what I wanted. By the time I left the hospital that day, my decision was starting to take shape. Letting him move in wasn't just a bad idea, it would be a disaster. It was clear that, if I let this happen, I'd lose not just my autonomy but everything I'd worked so hard to build. Update 4. After overhearing my dad's plan to sell my house and finally enjoy retirement, I knew it was time to set a hard boundary. But before I could take any action, my dad decided to escalate things himself. He left me a voicemail that started out calm but quickly turned into a rant. He said he was done waiting for my answer and would show up at my house by the weekend to settle this once and for all. It wasn't a threat, but the tone made it clear he expected me to cave. I forwarded the voicemail to my brother, who immediately stepped in. He offered to take over all communication with our dad to take the pressure off me. I agreed, grateful for the break. My brother called him that night to lay out some ground rules, but it didn't go as planned. My dad accused him of ganging up on him and refused to back down from his plan to show up at my house. That Saturday, just as I was about to leave for a friend's birthday party, my dad arrived. He banged on my front door like it was an emergency. I didn't answer, hoping he'd go away, but he didn't. Instead, he started yelling for me to let him in, claiming I was hiding and too cowardly to face him. The neighbors started peeking out their windows, and I knew I couldn't let this go on. I called the police. They arrived quickly, and after I explained the situation, they asked my dad to leave. He refused at first, insisting he had a right to be there as family. It wasn't until they threatened to arrest him for trespassing that he finally left. As he was escorted to his car, he turned back and yelled, "You're heartless. You'll regret this when I'm gone." The scene was embarrassing, but at least it was over, for now. The fallout from that incident was immediate. Word spread through the family like wildfire, and I started getting messages from relatives. Some were supportive, saying I did the right thing by protecting my space. Others were furious, accusing me of being cruel for involving the police. A few even said they were cutting ties with me entirely. It was draining, but I couldn't bring myself to care too much. I was more concerned about what my dad might do next. I reached out to my lawyer again to make sure I wasn't missing anything. They reassured me that I had no legal obligation to support my dad and reminded me that I had every right to enforce boundaries. It was comforting to hear, but it didn't solve the emotional toll of the situation. That night, I started writing a letter to my dad. It wasn't an apology, but it was honest. I explained why I couldn't let him move in and how his actions over the years had led to this point. It was one of the hardest things I've ever written, but when I finished, I wasn't sure if I should send it. Part of me hoped it would bring closure, but another part worried it would only fuel his anger. Meanwhile, my mom decided to take matters into her own hands. She posted her story on Facebook, sharing details about how she'd been left to raise 2 kids with little to no support from my dad. She wrote about how he'd drained their savings, ignored his responsibilities, and left her scrambling to make ends meet. Her post quickly gained traction, and people who had been siding with my dad started to see the bigger picture. While all this was happening, my dad tried another desperate move. He contacted my employer again, accusing me of neglecting family duties and claiming I was emotionally unstable. HR called me in, but instead of taking his accusations seriously, they offered me additional resources to cope with the harassment. They assured me my job wasn't in jeopardy, and even flagged his number to prevent further calls. It was a small win in an otherwise overwhelming situation. The tide started to shift as more family members learned the truth. My mom's post, combined with the journal and my dad's escalating behavior, opened their eyes. Relatives who had been quick to criticize me now reached out to apologize or offer support. It felt like a weight was lifting, even if just a little. My brother took things a step further. He arranged to meet with my dad one-on-one to put an end to the harassment. I wasn't there, but my brother later told me it was a tense conversation. He didn't hold back, telling our dad to stop using guilt and manipulation to get his way. He made it clear that if the behavior continued, there would be consequences. With my brother handling the confrontation, I focused on finishing the letter. After much deliberation, I decided to send it. It was my line in the sand. In the letter, I told him that I wouldn't let him move in and that my decision was final. I also made it clear that any further harassment would result in legal action. It wasn't easy to hit send, but it was necessary. This has been one of the hardest chapters of my life, but I finally feel like I'm regaining control. My dad's choices brought him to this point, and I'm done letting them dictate my life. Update 5. I thought the letter would mark the end of everything, but my dad had one more move left. A week after I sent it, I was served papers. He was suing me, claiming I was legally obligated to provide financial support as his child. The lawsuit was flimsy at best, but it still felt like a gut punch. It was clear he wasn't going to back down until he had wrung me dry. My first call was to my lawyer, who assured me we could fight this. Together, we began gathering every piece of evidence that showed how little my dad had contributed to my life, both emotionally and financially. I provided the journal my mom had kept, old records of unpaid child support, and even testimonies from relatives who had lent him money he never repaid. The case against him built itself. In the meantime, I updated Reddit about the lawsuit. The response was overwhelming. My post went viral, with thousands of people weighing in. Some shared legal advice, others offered emotional support, and a few trolls predictably tried to stir the pot. But the overwhelming message was clear: I wasn't alone. Many people had been in similar situations, and their stories reminded me why I had to stand my ground. My brother didn't hesitate to step up. He offered to testify on my behalf, recounting the years of neglect and manipulation we had endured. His willingness to stand with me solidified a bond between us that had grown stronger through this ordeal. We were finally on the same team, united against the chaos our dad had created. As news of the lawsuit spread, the remaining family members who had been defending my dad started to back away. They couldn't ignore the evidence piling up against him, and many distanced themselves entirely. A few even reached out to apologize for siding with him earlier. It didn't erase the hurt, but it was a step toward mending broken relationships. The day of the hearing arrived. The courtroom was quiet, almost too calm for the storm brewing inside. My dad sat across from me, looking frail but defiant. When it was his turn to speak, he painted himself as the victim, a retired man abandoned by his ungrateful children. He even shed a few tears for effect, claiming he had done his best as a father and didn't deserve to be left with nothing. When my turn came, my lawyer laid everything bare. The judge heard about the unpaid child support, the gambling debts, the extravagant purchases while my mom struggled to provide for us. My brother testified, detailing the years of manipulation and broken promises. The journal my mom had kept was the final nail in the coffin. It was impossible to argue with her meticulous record of every time he had failed us. The judge's decision was swift. My dad's case was dismissed, and the ruling was clear. I had no obligation to provide financial support. As the words left the judge's mouth, my dad slumped in his seat. The fight was over, and he had lost. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. This wasn't the victory I had imagined. I wasn't celebrating, I was mourning the relationship I'd never had with my dad. But it also felt like the weight I'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted. In the weeks that followed, some family members who had doubted me reached out to apologize. They admitted they hadn't known the full story and wanted to make amends. My mom's Facebook post had also shifted public opinion, giving people a clearer picture of what we had endured. Slowly but surely, I started to rebuild those relationships. My therapist helped me process everything. We talked about the guilt that lingered, even though I knew I had done the right thing. She reminded me that my dad's choices had led him to this point, and it wasn't my job to save him from the consequences. With the legal battle behind me, I focused on moving forward. My career became my priority again, and I found joy in the small things, spending time with friends, tackling new projects, and finally feeling at peace in my own home. My dad's presence, once a constant storm cloud, was no longer hanging over me. I still hear about him occasionally. Relatives say his financial situation has worsened, and he's burned bridges with most of the family. It's sad, but I've come to terms with it. His decline isn't mine to fix, and I've stopped feeling responsible for someone who never took responsibility for me. Through it all, my brother and I have grown closer. We've supported each other in ways we never did growing up, and I'm grateful to have him in my corner. This ordeal might have torn our family apart, but it also brought us together in a way I didn't expect. My Reddit post has taken on a life of its own, becoming a reference point for others in similar situations. People message me to share their stories, thank me for speaking up, or just say they feel less alone. It's bittersweet knowing so many others face the same struggles, but it's also a reminder that standing up for yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. Looking back, I realize now that choosing myself was the only option. My dad's choices shaped his path, but I refuse to let them shape mine. For the first time in years, I feel free.